Music is often remembered for how it sounds, but some artists are remembered for how it feels to exist because of them. Stevie Wonder belongs to that second category. His work didn't just become popular, it became embedded in human emotion itself, a catalog so deeply absorbed into culture that it doesn't feel like songs anymore, but like shared memory. 25 Grammy Awards, over 100 million records sold, yet even those numbers fail to explain why his music still lands with the same emotional force across generations that never witnessed its release. Because Stevie Wonder was never just building a career in music, he was expanding what music could carry. Emotion, resistance, healing, memory, and identity compressed into sound. And that's what makes his story difficult to frame in simple terms. He didn't grow up learning how to see the world, he learned how to reconstruct it through vibration, rhythm, and tone. From Saginaw, Michigan, emerged a child who experienced reality without sight, but developed an internal language of sound that would eventually reshape modern music itself. But the contrast between what the world hears and what the world assumes is where the real story begins, because the public version of Stevie Wonder is almost too clean to be complete. The joy, the movement, the warmth, those are real, but they sit on top of a life that carried far more friction than most people ever associate with his name. A childhood shaped by medical limitation and financial instability, early independence forced by circumstance rather than choice, a family structure marked by absence and pressure, and from the beginning, a life that required adaptation at a level most people never have to imagine. But what makes his trajectory unusual isn't just what he overcame, it's what developed because of it. Sound didn't become compensation for sight, it became something closer to structure itself. Rhythm wasn't entertainment, it was orientation. Music wasn't expression, it was mapping. While others learned the world through what they could see, he built his understanding through what he could hear. And that difference didn't stay private. It became the foundation of everything he would later create. But success didn't simplify his life. It multiplied its contradictions. As fame expanded, so did distance from anything resembling stability. Relationships formed, shifted, and dissolved under pressures that achievement alone couldn't stabilize. Fatherhood arrived across different chapters of his life, each shaped by different circumstances, each carrying its own emotional complexity. Presence and absence often existed in tension rather than balance, because the same force that made him globally influential also kept him in motion, and motion rarely leaves room for stillness. By the time the 1970s turned into the 1980s, Stevie Wonder wasn't just a successful musician, he had become part of the cultural atmosphere itself. His sound was everywhere. His influence was unquestionable. But the higher the recognition climbed, the less visible the personal cost became to the outside world. The audience heard brilliance. They didn't hear what it demanded. There is a tension in this story that rarely gets spoken out loud. The same man who gave the world "Isn't She Lovely" and "You Are the Sunshine of My Life" also lived a reality where sustaining that kind of love in everyday life was far more complicated than writing about it. But that isn't a contradiction. It's the pattern. Because emotional intelligence in art does not automatically translate into emotional stability in life. Genius does not override human limits. He could translate love into melody with precision, but living it continuously across time requires a different kind of balance entirely. And most audiences never sit with that discomfort for long. It is easier to remember the songs than to examine what stood behind them. Easier to hold on to the voice than to consider what it carried. But silence doesn't erase what was lived inside it. It only hides it from public view. Private grief doesn't disappear, it accumulates. And over time, it settles in places applause never reaches. In his later years, Stevie Wonder has stepped further away from the machinery of performance. Time, health challenges, and personal priorities have shifted him toward a quieter existence, one centered less on global expectation and more on family, rest, and self-preservation. Not as an icon on display, but as a person living within his own life again. The world honored him at the highest level, and he accepted it with grace, aware of what it meant and what it could never measure. Because recognition shows output, It does not show cost. What it never captured was what sustained the music. Years of medical strain, strained relationships, children who needed presence more than legacy, a mother's absence that left a silence no song could fill, and the loss of friends and peers that made time feel heavier with each passing year. Each loss added weight the public never had to carry. And still, he continued. When he said music is a world within itself, with a language we all understand, it wasn't only about listeners, it was survival, a place to exist when the real world became too limiting, unstable, or painful. In that world, sight was unnecessary. Grief could be reshaped without being denied. Pain was not erased, but translated into something that could be shared without breaking the one carrying it. That is the world he built. For more than 75 years, he lived inside it and extended it outward to others. Every song offered without condition. Every album a fragment of lived experience, handed to strangers who often only later realized how deeply it had reached them. What he created was not simply entertainment, it was continuity. A reminder that emotion does not stop when life becomes difficult. It changes form and continues forward through sound. And what his story demands now is not just admiration, but perspective. To see him completely, not as only an icon and not as only a private individual hidden behind it, but as both at once. The brilliance and the exhaustion, the joy and the pressure, the elevation and the cost. Because separating those layers makes the story easier to consume, but less honest to understand. He was born without sight, and still found a way to help others see. If his music has ever reached you in a way words could not, then it has already done what it was built to do. Connect something private within you to something shared across millions of others. And when those songs return again, Superstition, Isn't She Lovely, You Are the Sunshine of My Life, they are no longer just nostalgia or memory. They are documentation of everything it took to make them possible. The incubator, the instability, the silence of loss, the years of recovery and repetition, the relationships that fractured under pressure, the rooms where healing had to happen slowly and repeatedly, the absences that marked time more than any calendar ever could. All of it exists inside the music, not as decoration, but as transformation. And yet the songs still move forward, because that was always the point. Not that life avoids breaking, but that even in what breaks, something can still be made to sing.